Hello and welcome to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Institute is one of the world's leading centers for interdisciplinary exploration. We bring students, scholars, artists, and practitioners together to pursue curiosity-driven research, expand human understanding, and grapple with questions that demand insights from across disciplines. You can be part of this vibrant community by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collections held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more, you can visit radcliffe.harvard.edu and sign up to receive more information on news and events. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Erica Chenoweth. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. It is my pleasure to introduce Erica Chenoweth, who is the Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. We're very pleased to have Susan Wallach in the audience today. Thank you, Susan, for your generosity. Professor Chenoweth studies political violence and its alternatives. Most recently, they published Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know in 2021. Through an accessible and conversational style, the book investigates what civil resistance is, how it works, why it sometimes fails, how violence and repression affect it, and the long-term impacts of such resistance. Chenoweth's book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict with Maria J. Stephan, won the 2013 Gromeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order and the 2012 Best Book Awards for the American Political Science Association. The research has been featured in outlets such as the Boston Globe, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The New Yorker, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. Additionally, they are a prolific blogger. They co-host the award-winning blog Political Violence at a Glance and blog occasionally at the Monkey Cage at the Washington Post. Foreign Policy magazine ranked Professor Chenoweth among the top 100 global thinkers in 2013 for their efforts to promote the empirical study of nonviolent resistance. During the Radcliffe Fellowship year, along with Harvard Kennedy School's Professor Zoe Marks, Chenoweth is working on their next book project, Bread and Roses, Women and the Frontlines of Revolution. This book explores the impact of women's participation on the outcomes of mass movement. Assembling the first global data set of women participation in hundreds of armed and unarmed mass uprisings from 1900 to 2019, they find that extensive women's participation have made movements more likely to remove an incumbent leader from power or achieve national independence, and that movements that excluded women were much more likely to fail. Together with Jeremy Pressman, Chenoweth co-directs the Crowd Counting Consortium, a public interest and research project that documents political mobilization in the United States since 2017. This project has benefited from the Radcliffe Research Program Partnership Program this year. Professor Chenoweth earned her MA and PhD in political science from the University of Colorado. In 2014, they received the Karl Deutsch Award, which the International Studies Association gives annually to the scholar under the age of 40 who has made the most significant impact on the field of international politics or peace research. In their spare time, Professor Chenoweth enjoys fly fishing, maple sugaring, and experimenting with sustainable farming. It is my pleasure to give the floor to Erica Chenoweth.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for that generous introduction. And thanks to everyone who's joining us on this call today. I especially want to thank all of the staff at Radcliffe, the fellows, the supporters of Radcliffe, and the broader Radcliffe community for making this such a productive and enriching year for me. Today, I want to talk about the research behind a book in progress by myself and Zoe Marks, my colleague at Harvard Kennedy School. But I first want to tell you a little bit about how I became interested in this topic. So as Claudia mentioned, much of my recent research, in fact, much of my research over the past 15 years, has focused on revolutionary movements. What makes mass mobilization or mass uprisings succeed or fail? And I'm interested in both armed and unarmed resistance movements. That is, movements that are primarily unarmed, where people use protests, strikes, boycotts, and other forms of mass non-cooperation to achieve their aims. And I'm also interested in violent movements where the primary method of achieving revolutionary change is armed struggle, guerrilla warfare, armed assaults, assassinations, and terror. And one of the most striking things about these two different modes of resistance is how they've shifted over time. So as you can see in this chart, which shows the ongoing data collection that I've undertaken with colleagues, you can see that at least since the 1980s, most revolutionary movements, that is those that are demanding the overthrow of the incumbent national leader or national liberation, have primarily relied on people power, that is to say unarmed resistance methods, and armed struggle has begun to decline as a primary mode of resistance over time. So as I mentioned, these data focus on revolutionary campaigns where the demands are to overthrow the incumbent national leader or territorial independence, either by kicking out a colonial power, seceding, or kicking out a foreign military occupation. And those terms are important because a limitation of the data is that it doesn't necessarily apply to all different types of movements and all different types of claims. So I just want to scope what I'm about to say in those terms. So in drilling down in these data, one of the really helpful patterns that we can discern is what makes these campaigns succeed or fail. And in general, scholars, including myself and many others who've replicated studies on data like these, have found that there are really four things that make mass revolutionary movements successful. The first thing is numbers. The larger the movement, the more likely it is to succeed. The second is tactical innovation. That is to say that movements that are able to create and promote creative disruptive tactics that build pressure on the opponent are more likely to succeed than those that rely on more predictable or just symbolic actions. The third factor is defections, meaning that not only does the movement grow in size and diversity, but also that the movement is able to begin to divide the loyalties of the pillars of support upholding the existing system: economic and business elites, political elites, the inner entourage of the opponent, security forces, state media, civil service, and the like. And the fourth factor is resilience, which is to say that revolutionary movements that succeed tend to have the ability to withstand repression as it escalates against them, and they are able to maneuver in a disciplined way when repression does escalate. And this typically requires some degree of organizational infrastructure and leadership that both expects and can handle such losses. So over the years, since 2011 at least, I've been quite involved with workshops with activists from all around the world, including in the United States. And I've been learning much more from them about what they see on the ground as impacting their prospects for success and the types of strategies that they adopt in order to achieve success. And among other lessons, one of the most common themes that has begun to resonate over time is that women-identified activists often feel that their frontline work has either been underrepresented or erased altogether in the global history of revolution, a history that typically lionizes male leaders, thinkers, intellectuals, and strategists. And to be sure, there are feminists who have worked to recover the histories of women's roles, in particular revolutionary movements, in specific cases. But there's never been a full and systematic accounting of the ways in which women's participation in mass movements has affected the strategic options of those movements, their successes, and the consequences of those movements for global history, or indeed the way in which women's work in revolutionary campaigns has been fundamental to the development of revolutionary strategies in the first place. And this erasure is incredibly important because if we fail to understand how women's participation has affected the political, social, and economic power and possibilities inherent in revolutionary movements, and the transformations that can be made possible by such revolutionary movements, then these movements may be doomed to repeat mistakes of the past by sidelining, minimalizing, or even subjugating the work of women activists. Today, because of the global democratic recession that is taking place around the world, we need to know what it takes to effectively defend democracy against autocratic backsliding and patriarchal autocracy and white supremacist autocracy. And as Zoe and I show, excluding women-identified activists from movements has consequences both for the sustainability of global democracy and gender equality. Failing to appreciate the risks that women take when they mobilize for revolution can also facilitate the patriarchal backlash that occurs in the aftermath of defeated revolutions, a backlash that affects women but also affects everyone. So I want to make an important point, which is first that women always are present in revolutions. But the degree to which they have played frontline roles in revolutionary movements has varied over time and over movements. And so what I'm most interested in and what Zoe is interested in is what are the strategic consequences for movements when they look more like the movement up on the upper left-hand corner of the screen right now compared to the lower right-hand corner of the screen. What are the political impacts of gender expression, the performance of gender, and the possibilities that are unleashed in renegotiating gender in transgressive spaces in the context of revolutionary movements? Zoe brings to bear her considerable expertise on women in armed groups, particularly in revolutionary campaigns in sub-Saharan Africa, where there have been similar patterns of erasure and invisibility, and where there's been important variation in the outcomes of mass movements as well. So the research questions that will animate the findings that I discuss in short order are basically these. The first is, how does variation in women's participation affect the outcomes of revolutionary movements? And perhaps more important for the long term, how do inclusive revolutions affect the post-revolutionary milieu? So in order to undertake a systematic analysis of these questions, what Zoe and I have done is try to extend the database that I've been maintaining for a number of years on global revolutionary movements to include indicators that try to help us catalog in a systematic way and in a way that can be compared across cases, the reported or observed participation of women on the front lines. And so we're calling this the Women in Resistance Data Project, and the results that I'm presenting today rely on a random sample of 338 of these campaigns during the post-war period through 2014. And Zoe and I have been completing the full population of cases that amount to 556 revolutionary campaigns up through 2019 with the help of Radcliffe Research Fellows. And we're also creating a database called Wire Plus, which is the full population of 209 campaigns from 1990 through 2019, which adds indicators on LGBTQ+ and youth participation. But for the purposes of this presentation, I want to focus more on women-identified activists. And what we do is we add indicators to the database that try to get at the extent of women's participation using a categorical variable. And the categorical variable basically identifies whether there are effectively no women observed on the front lines of combat or on the front lines of a protest movement over the course of its campaign, its active campaign. Then we look at cases where women were present, but in small numbers. We call that limited frontline participation. Then we look at whether women were represented in higher numbers, but less than parity, and we call that moderate participation. And then when women effectively appear to be about half of the participant base or more, we call that extensive frontline participation. And I can talk in the Q&A about the data generation process for that categorical variable. And what we're interested in is basically using a variety of different modeling techniques to try to understand the impacts of those different categories on the outcomes of the movement in the short and long term. So one of the short-term outcomes that we're interested in is the success or failure of the campaign. And success is defined by the achievement of the campaign's stated goals within a year of the peak of its mobilization. And that means that they expelled an incumbent national leader or that they achieved full legal and de facto territorial independence within a year of the peak of the mobilization. And that's a strict criteria for success, but it allows for a very systematic comparison across cases. The second set of outcomes that we're interested in, as I mentioned, is what happens to the societies after the campaigns are over. And so here we rely on the Varieties of Democracy, or VDEM database, which provides a measure for what's called egalitarian democracy and women's empowerment indices. And we look at them 5 years after the campaign has ended. And the reason I say egalitarian democracy is that we are much less interested in democratic systems that promote more neoliberal agendas. And we are interested in egalitarian democracies that not only enshrine equal protection of rights across groups and individuals, but also societies in which institutionalized democracy also institutionalizes shared resources across groups and effectively attempts to eliminate differences on identity, class, or gender lines. So we're very interested in the model of genuinely egalitarian democracy, an ideal which has never been fully achieved by any country, but which does exist on a spectrum, and we're interested in the countries that have moved higher up on the spectrum. And then women's empowerment is another index that VDEM maintains that looks at basically laws that protect women against arbitrary exclusion from political, social, and economic opportunity. So let me move ahead into some of the descriptives of these data. One of the first things that's very interesting about our database is that there's very interesting variation in the degree to which women are participating on the front lines, depending on whether the campaign relies primarily on armed or unarmed methods of resistance. So one of the perhaps most striking findings in the data is that women are observed in much greater numbers in unarmed campaigns. That is to say, they seem to be more present and visibly present on the front lines of unarmed campaigns than on the front lines of armed campaigns. So basically, armed campaigns are much more likely to be fully exclusionary of women, as you can see on the left-hand side of this bar chart. And unarmed campaigns are the only ones in which we've seen genuinely extensive frontline women's participation. What are the effects of this? Well, one of the things that we find is that when you control for a variety of other factors that also have been found to affect the success of revolutionary movements, those in which women have been featured in extensive levels, that is, there's about half of the frontline participants are observed to be women identified participants. those movements are much more likely to succeed than those that sideline or exclude women. In fact, if we go back to those 4 factors that explain why movements succeed, we can see that women's active participation on the front lines is genuinely fundamental to the development of the capacities that revolutionary movements need. For one thing, movements are going to be much larger when they feature women on the front lines. In fact, our data suggests that the average peak participation is not just 2 times larger, as you might expect, with 50% of the population suddenly becoming available as a recruitment pool, but in fact, the average peak participation is 7.5 times larger when women are reported on the front lines of mass movements. Part of the reason for that may be because of the horizontal network effects of women's mobilization that have been found in many other literatures, as opposed to the more vertical network effects that have been identified in male social networks. The second reason why resistance movements might be more successful when women are so highly featured on the front lines relates to the social power that comes with mass women's participation. In particular, social power can lead to defections, which I'll describe in a moment, but it also comes with a high degree of social knowledge about the particular levers of society that may be vulnerable to defection or to disruptive creative pressure. For example, some people might be surprised to know the origins of the boycott as a technique. The word boycott actually comes from the name of the target of the boycott, Captain Charles Boycott, who was an absentee British landlord who was charging rents and evicting people if they could not pay for manors in Ireland under British colonial rule. In the 1880s, both the Irish Ladies' Land League and peasant women in Ireland mobilized an ostracization campaign in which not only did they refuse to pay rents, but they also refused to provide services. The seamstresses and laundresses, the chefs, the cooks, the shopkeepers, and everyone else involved in maintaining the land and the labor for the land withheld their labor and in fact refused to sell him food or other services in town. Captain Boycott was effectively driven out of Ireland. He retreated to England, where he died a few years later. But this was a technique that then came to be known as the boycott. It was part of a variety of other techniques that the Ladies' Land League and Irish peasant women also pursued, including the repossession of lands, the reinstatement of evicted tenants, and in fact, building huts with their own bare hands for people who had been evicted from their homes on their land so that they could have temporary shelter. These were tactics that were innovated by these women because exactly they knew how life could be made impossible for people if they withheld their cooperation. One of the notable things about the Ladies' Land League in particular is that it was able to survive for a long period after there was a period of mass repression against Irish nationalists by the British. The National Irish Land League, which was the male-dominated one, was actually banned, but the Ladies' Land League persisted in spite of the ban and performed most of the functions of the previous Nationalist League and in fact innovated new ones. Now, the boycott is a familiar word today, but one of the most important people that it influenced was Mohandas Gandhi, who was impressed with these tactics of what he called obstruction and non-cooperation, and who recognized the potential power of mass non-cooperation against British colonialism in another part of the world, which was the Indian subcontinent. And so Gandhi had his own critiques of the Irish national movement at the time, but he also borrowed what was working. And as you probably know, the technique of satyagraha that Gandhi later developed involved 2 co-equal prongs. One was mass non-cooperation. The other was the development of an alternative that would be self-reliant. That is to say, that would not require dependence on colonial products and instead would allow people to build their own future regardless of what the colonial power was trying to do. There are other familiar cases in which women's tactical innovation made for profound political power building opportunities. Igbo women, for example, in Nigeria, who were resisting a sustained campaign of colonial taxation in the aftermath of the Great Depression and the expansion of power of warrant chiefs to rule over colonized lands in Nigeria, developed techniques and cultivated techniques that had long been part of the feminist arsenal there, including a technique called sitting on a man. And sitting on a man involved basically women surrounding someone's home and refusing to leave. Sometimes they would occupy the home, sometimes they would tear it down, sometimes they would simply sing or scream hostilities toward them. Either way, it was a major form of stigmatizing people who had stepped out of line. It was a highly effective technique. The British colonial authorities had no idea how to deal with it, and in fact documented this as the so-called Aba women's riots, where Igbo feminists have recovered the history and know it as the Igbo Women's War. And as you probably know, women played a very key role in Russia's February Revolution, in part because they were so adept at political education in factory settings and industrial settings in which women were overrepresented. So they were crucial in organizing strikes, shutting down and sitting in factories and marching in the streets during that period of the revolution. Non-cooperation, including boycotts and the development of alternative institutions, also played an absolutely crucial role in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Black women were such a formidable constituency against apartheid as it was becoming consolidated in South Africa in the mid-20th century, that their economic power was curtailed by the white supremacist government's abolishing of trade unions, in which women were extremely highly represented and in which they did a great deal of their own political education work. During the boycotts of the late 80s and into the early 90s, women's mobilization was crucial in the anti-apartheid movement by developing cooperatives, strike funds, and other shared food and clothing stocks to withstand the economic effects of the strike and boycott campaigns that were taking place against white-owned businesses in South Africa. So I've talked about numbers and I've talked about tactical innovation. I want to talk too about the effects of women's participation on security forces. So security force defections are one of the most important factors in explaining when authoritarian regimes collapse. You might be familiar with images from various different revolutionary periods, the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, for example, in which people are putting roses or carnations into the gun barrels of security forces. This is more than just a symbolically interesting visual. This is also real politics, because in many places, whether they are colonial regimes or autocratic regimes, basically security force loyalty can make or break the political future of the regime. And so when security forces choose to step away or stand aside, it can actually basically create critical mass and threshold effects that cascade into the collapse of even great powers. And so what we see is that when women are involved in higher numbers on the front line, we are indeed more likely to see instances in which security forces defect. And part of the reason for this relates to, as I mentioned before, the potential for women to bring to bear their networks, their social networks, and their social power on particular key political moments. In Serbia in 2000, there were hundreds of thousands of people who descended on Belgrade to demand that Slobodan Milosevic leave power after a fraudulent election. And the police had been quite happy to suppress protesters in this particular campaign before, but there was something different that happened on October 5th of 2000. And that was that there were so many people and so many people from so many different walks of life that security forces started to say very interesting things, which is, I thought I saw my kid in the crowd, or I thought I saw my brother-in-law, or I thought I saw the guy who sells me liquor at a discount on Saturdays, or whatever it was. They began to know people. And when they knew people, they decided not to follow the order to shoot, which was given. And they ignored it and pretended that they didn't hear it. And so what you can imagine is that when women are involved in large numbers, the social effects on the potential for security forces to have to consider whether it is in their personal interest, that is their personal social interest, imagining themselves in the future of the country, is served by following orders to fire live fire on demonstrators and the like. You know, women are able often to basically exploit taboos that might exist against public abuse of women. Now, these taboos are obviously double-edged swords in many different places, but sometimes they can work to political effects, like the time that nuns in Manila stood between the tanks and the armed forces and protesters who were demanding that Ferdinand Marcos step down. The last factor I want to talk about is discipline. And discipline relates to the ability, as I mentioned, of movements to withstand escalating repression by sticking to their own plan and having some kind of organizational infrastructure that can maneuver in critical times, say from concentrated tactics like protests into more dispersed tactics like stayaways with general strikes, which are absolutely crucial as a capacity for revolutionary movements to carry out, and which can scarcely be possible without the active participation of women on the front lines. So, you know, here again, we can see that when women are involved in very high numbers, it is much less likely that movements that are facing active repression begin to break down their discipline. By this, I mean begin to engage in much more violent armed activity in the context of an otherwise nonviolent campaign, which can have its own kind of political effects and often backfires and allows for greater repression. In Sudan's 2019 revolution, we can see all of these effects taking place. So women participating in very large numbers in the Sudanese revolution drew on much of their social knowledge. For example, there was a women's dating gossip group on Facebook that ended up being used to name and shame people in the who were plainclothes police and who were particularly abusive toward protesters. And so they were able to call them out and actually use techniques called interpositioning, which was surrounding them and removing them from the scene. They were also able to shift to general strikes. The tea sellers of Khartoum effectively dispersed after major crackdowns. There were teachers who came from Darfur, like Halima Ishaq, who stood on a chair and told all of the protesters that she could speak to from her position to bring everyone they knew to a sit-in outside the military headquarters until democracy came to Sudan. There are many different iconic examples of women on the front lines of that revolutionary movement. But the key thing is that without them, it's hard to imagine the movement having effectively toppled Omar al-Bashir. So I want to talk next about the problem of what happens after these movements are over and what the consequences are. And the answer is that it really depends. It depends on whether revolutionary movements succeed at that initial phase, that is, whether they actually topple the opponent or whether they effectively achieve territorial independence. And so what you can see on the left-hand side here is that the red line is showing the patterns of improvement in egalitarian democracy compared to those of failed campaigns, which is the blue lines. And for the unarmed campaigns, you can see that when women participate in high numbers, the higher the numbers of women frontline participants, the more likely the country is to emerge as an more egalitarian democracy 5 years after the campaign ends. The same is true for armed campaigns. But take a look at what happens to unarmed campaigns that don't succeed, or in other words, are defeated at that critical moment. Not only do they have lower rates of, or lower progress toward egalitarian democracy, but they're actually worse off than they were when they started. And this is mostly true for campaigns in which a high number of women are participating. So in other words, something's happening here, not just to the fact that the country is sliding back into authoritarianism, but that it's doing so even more virulently when there are more women represented. We see the same pattern with regard to women's empowerment indices. It's a little bit more of a modest effect, but it's still there. That when women participate in large numbers in revolutionary campaigns, not in feminist movements, but in revolutionary campaigns, they're more likely to increase to modest degrees gender empowerment index. But they're also much more likely to have patriarchal backlash when they fail. So I think the key takeaways from our findings are, first of all, that it's clear that women's frontline participation is helping revolutionary movements win, and that this success can create historical opportunities for egalitarian democracy and gender equality to diffuse. And I think that even more broadly, what we found here is a pattern that shows how women's participation in revolutionary movements has probably been a very unappreciated factor driving not just revolutionary outcomes, but also the sheer spread of democratization around the world in the post-war period. Because the primary way that democracy spread during the post-war period was through people power. On the other hand, when inclusive movements were defeated, patriarchal authoritarian backlash was intense. And so I want to talk a little bit about what this means going forward. And this is how I'll end. So as we see what's been transpiring in Ukraine and Russia today, many people have asked me what I look for and what I look at. And what I would have told you 2 years ago is different from what I would tell you now. What I would tell you now is that certainly I would watch for numbers, defections, tactical creativity, and resilience, but I would especially watch for the way that women are on the front lines or not, whether they're present, absent, being sidelined, minimized, and whatever the process is for resolving the conflict, which eventually there will be one, whether women are represented in equal numbers in that process as well. So far, a lot of the negotiations that have taken place haven't involved any women, and this is dangerous and problematic. But I also think that there are some hopeful signs, which is that if we do look for the way that women are involved both in Ukraine and in Russia, we can see that there is a promise, not just for, there are some promising patterns, not just for the potential for people to continue resisting the war, but also for people to simply exercise their own agency and forge new tactical innovations that basically are then delivered into the collective conscience and knowledge base for how to resist authoritarianism more effectively. But I think that the sort of broader implication is that what autocrats and patriarchs are the most afraid of is genuine people power, and genuine people power challenging the status quo. And so Zoe and I have kind of documented our worries about this democratic recession that is taking place around the world, the democratic recession taking place in the United States, the ways in which the democratic recession underway in the United States is being effectively carried out, both by cracking down on women's equality, LGBTQ and trans youth, and Black voters and Black women voters and Black women in particular, and the ways that this follows a very disturbing pattern of patriarchal authoritarian backlash and the aftermath of mass movements in which women have played a crucial role. And so if history is any guide, we know that, that women's frontline participation can provide a major check on the spread and success of patriarchal authoritarianism, but nothing is guaranteed and can't be taken for granted. So I want to thank the people who've provided excellent research assistance on this project and those who provided funding for it. And with that, I will end and very much look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Back to you, Claudia.
Well, incredibly fascinating. As you can imagine, there are lots of questions, so I'll get there too immediately. So the first question is, okay, hold on a minute. Yeah, to the question of untangling causes from effects, could it simply be that women join a revolutionary uprising in large numbers when they perceive that the movement is likely to succeed?
This is a very good question, and it depends on the sort of theory of change that one subscribes to. If it were true that that women just kind of auto-mobilized when it was obvious that the regime was collapsing, for example, we'd probably see that more at the end of a mass mobilization rather than the beginning of it. And also, we would probably see more improvised women's participation compared to, say, the organizational mobilization of women's groups, formal women's associations, women's labor organizations, and women in the context of other politically relevant associations and groups. And we see more of the latter than the former, which is to say that when women do participate in mass numbers, it's usually something that is strategic, that is intentional, and that is fundamental to then the trajectory of the campaign going forward. And so I think that it's a really good and important question. And certainly there needs to be more research to untangle the overtime impacts in order to get more squarely at the question of causality. But I, knowing many of these cases and talking to many activists, know that they are intentional about what they're doing, and they're also highly uncertain about the outcome, right? So they don't know that the movement is going to succeed. They certainly hope so, because the stakes, as we've just seen, are much higher for them than for anyone else.
Have you identified situations in which women wanted to participate, but their voices or actions were silenced? If yes, what were the outcomes of those situations?
Well, I think that there are degrees of this. So on the one hand, there are certainly movements in which women have been totally excluded. The Taliban is a good example of an armed insurgent group that basically didn't have any kind of systematic observed frontline participation of women. They're excluded. That's an extreme example. There are other examples where, say, women wanted to participate actively, or women from different backgrounds wanted to participate actively and were excluded because of their background, their identity, their class, or whatever. And this too is a way of really reducing the political power and potential of the movement for transformation. There are also cases where women aren't necessarily excluded, but it's not made easy for them to participate. So for example, if women have, because of the nature of society, they have more caring responsibilities, and planning meetings are planned in person at times that are very inconvenient for many people with caring responsibilities, that can just effectively make it difficult for women to participate. And another kind of thing that can happen in many movements is that women participate, but by themselves, like they're sort of segregated into their own columns, as it were. To that extent, they're being instrumentalized. Say, armed groups like the FARC often had some sex segregation going on, where women and men combatants could both be present, but not like, there's sort of sex segregation. It's not clear what the effects are of that compared to, say, if you have mixed participation at all levels. But that is definitely a question for future research. But the answer is that, yes, there are campaigns in which women are totally excluded or excluded to a certain extent. And the finding is that the movements tend to fail more often and tend to lead less often to improvements in democracy and gender equality.
Right. Another question along the same lines is, are tactics gendered, and how do feminist ideas and strategies shape the tactical innovations?
I think many tactics are highly gendered. Feminist contributions to this have been totally profound, in part because they name the fact that tactics are gendered, but also they provide some creative options for finding new avenues for transgressions that don't that actually help build power for the movement, as opposed to say alienate potential supporters. For example, one very interesting gendered tactic that we saw play out in Myanmar last year was the parading of beauty queens in Myanmar down the streets in opposition to the coup. This might not resonate everywhere, but in Myanmar, there was a very powerful public effect of seeing women who had been kind of highlighted as great beauties in their society and like highly feminized individuals who were also very vulnerable, basically putting themselves on the front lines in a way that that demonstrated solidarity, that demonstrated universality to the claims and a certain sense of legitimacy that these people who we've been watching on TV are for democracy too. There are also many different types of gendered tactics that pull more on taboos. For example, in Kenya, a very well-known Nobel Peace Prize winning activist, she talked about the fact that when police would come and try to abuse the protesters, women would sometimes strip. And the reason is because there was a cultural taboo against seeing elderly women naked. And it brought shame to the police and repelled them. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the movement is going to win, but it definitely protects people in the short term. And so there are many different tactics that draw on the gendered resources that people have at their disposal to, in some cases, save lives in the moment.
Right. The next question, is there a pattern of differences regarding the purposes of movements that women massively participate in from those movements in which they don't?
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Sure. Is there a pattern of differences regarding the purpose of the movement between the movement in which women participate in and those that don't participate in?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. And the answer is I don't really know, because because so many of the cases that we're comparing here are comparable to one another in terms of their goals. So like I mentioned, they're all revolutionary campaigns. And so that means they're trying to get an incumbent national leader out of power or national liberation. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them have like a left valence. They're progressive or radical left movements, usually demanding democracy. Some of them are not. Some of them are, especially in more recent years, are more right-leaning movements, and this includes Islamist fundamentalists, but also far-right movements, and they're fewer in number, but I would certainly expect that to have an impact. But we didn't actually classify the movements according to that, in part because in many of them there's there are people power movements that kind of collect a huge coalition of participants. For example, the Iranian Revolution is in the database, and the Iranian Revolution was basically a conglomeration of Marxists and Islamists. So there was a huge diversity of ideological participation and representation in that particular revolution, before the Ayatollah came to power. So that's the reason. But your question also points out a limitation of the data, which I mentioned earlier, which is that we're not really looking at every different type of mass movement that has existed, and we can definitely imagine plenty of mass movements that would be variously sort of hospitable or inhospitable to feminist or women's participation. That's another opportunity for further research.
The next question asks, have you looked at how the impacts of women's participation varies with different roles of women in pre-revolutionary society? I think you talked a little bit about Afghanistan earlier, but for example, is women's participation more impactful if it is culturally unexpected or unlikely?
Mm-hmm. I think this is a great question. We're still looking into it. The one really interesting finding is that there doesn't seem to be too much variation in these sort of top line findings based on the region of the world, based on population size, based on GDP per capita, and other factors that otherwise have been found to correlate to, say, the spread of democracy and the spread of women's equality initiatives. So that's fascinating because it suggests that this pattern is actually something that is being driven by these mass movements, as opposed to the mass movements being caused by or cultivated by a structural environment that makes it easier for them to organize this way. That said, there is some research out there that suggests that when women are more represented in the workforce, they may be more likely to mobilize through particularly nonviolent action. And part of the reason for that is because they end up having more direct access to those levers of economic non-cooperation, which make it easier and more efficient to use mass non-cooperation as a technique. They also then would presumably have collective bargaining capacities, potentially organizations through unions and other things that would give them a skill set amenable to nonviolent resistance in particular. But we haven't tried to replicate that finding in our database yet, but it is a finding that exists.
Right. So there is a question about how the data set is built, which I think is quite interesting. How did you determine which movements had women on the front lines? Did you use news stories or some sort of survey to code women's participation?
Yeah, so we used basically numerous sources. News sources are more useful in the past, say, 30 years of data collection. But when we go all the way back to the 1940s and really up through the 80s, it can be very difficult to find mentions of women's participation in movements in the news. Occasionally it's there, but it's usually like, a spokeswoman from some organization rather than rather than a description of the degree to which women were participating. And so what our team does and has been doing is we look to different types of documentation. This can include photographs of peak events in which we literally look at the photos and look for ourselves at who appears to be present at the sort of peak events related to the revolutionary movement. We read, when they're available, primary sources written as memoirs by participants. We read feminist histories, which over the past 40 years have flourished around particular revolutions and women's roles in them. And there's actually a growing interest in the armed conflict research area in trying to identify women's participation in basically civil wars. And so we are able to validate our data against data collected independently by other scholars as well. So we use a variety of different source materials. And I think that makes the research process incredibly lively and informative, because we find out not just, whether women were there, but what they were doing and how they contributed to the outcome.
Absolutely. I guess one last question. Do you have any practical suggestions for how to achieve more wins in the USA when the forces of oppression are legislative and so may seem more legitimate to many?
Well, I think that the general, there's no formula for effective resistance, but there are things that seem to make resistance more effective. And they're the four things I mentioned. So mass, large numbers. The second is the ability to create defections. So that is basically getting people who are in positions of power and influence to either step out of the way of the movement's demands or come over to the movement altogether. The third thing is tactical innovation, and that's actually something that can be difficult in democracies where protest is the sort of main mode of resistance, as opposed to economic non-cooperation, which is a much more powerful mode of resistance. And then the fourth thing is resilience and building organizational capacity, focusing on linking community organizing and grassroots organizing to mobilizing, and seeing those as complementary kind of traditions rather than competitive ones. But in the United States, it's a federal system. Most of the power grabs happening right now are happening at the state level. And so as a result, most of the organizing and mobilizing that can have an effect at creating those defections would be more effective if they focused at the state level.
Well, this is all we have time for today. Thank you, Erica, for your fascinating presentations and your perspective. I also want to thank the audience for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.